Welcome, everyone. I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders, welcoming you to our call on the future of truth, philanthropy's role in combating misinformation. It's obviously a very busy time for the concerns about fake news and every other subject related to this topic. Just this morning, the Aspen Institute and the Knight Foundation kicked off their new commission on media, truth, and democracy, among many of the programs, projects, events that are happening around this subject. I also wanted to just note that this series of calls takes place in the context of our wider work for journalism. We have a journalism network that has a monthly call. This will serve as our monthly call for the Journalism Funders Network. As well, we're interested in the issue of the science of communications, and we're going to be initiating calls and programs later this month in that area of work. These are all interconnected and related issues. We recognize that, but we really wanted to devote a specific focus on these issues in a call and a webinar that we wanted to open. Unlike many of our programs, which are for funders only, we wanted to open this up to media outlets and practitioners and nonprofits, in addition to a very strong gathering of funders who are concerned about this, to share information more broadly. And with that, I also want to just thank our convener of this, the instigator of all of this, is Kelly Bourne, a program officer at the Madison Initiative at the Hewlett Foundation, and also a board member at Media Impact Funders. Thank you very much, Kelly, for kicking us off here, and take it away.
Thank you, Vince, and everybody for helping put this together. This has been great. And let me apologize first for not being able to join via video. I'm on the road, and it's a little bit complicated technologically, but I'm really glad this has all come together. And as Vince mentioned, and I should also say with Hewlett, the Democracy Fund, and Rita Allen Foundation, we've all really partnered for years looking at issues around the media and information environment, how it's evolving, and threats that poses to democracy in the U.S. And so this has been something that we've been exploring for quite some time, but I think, as with many of us, these recent disinformation challenges have really brought these efforts and concerns back to the fore for all of us. And so I've spent the last year or so just canvassing different proposed solutions to the disinformation challenges, really just trying to get our arms around what, if anything, philanthropy can do to help mitigate this problem. And in exploring the sort of hundreds of proposed solutions that are out there, they fall roughly into three main categories along the sort of information production and consumption spectrum. So issues around the production of information, which is the focus of this call, by which we really mean just challenges and opportunities around improving journalism through enhanced revenue models, audience engagement, diversity efforts. So really the whole range of efforts to improve the field of journalism. And that's the focus of this first call. Then the second call, which will happen a month from now, is really around the distribution of information and what has changed in the media landscape, particularly looking at the role of the internet and the impact that has had on the quality of information that people are consuming. And then the third call, which Elizabeth at Rita Allen will oversee, is around audience-facing efforts to improve the consumption of information like news literacy and fact-checking. And so each of these calls focuses on one of these distinct sort of leverage points. And I think there are some really interesting opportunities in each of these, which the panelists will cover, and also some challenges. You know, looking at journalism, I think there are, in some instances, great quality information out there and available on a range of issues. And the problem is that people really just trust different sources at this point. And we'll touch on that some in this call. And then on the distribution call, which I'll oversee, it's really not even clear yet how real echo chamber challenges are there are a ton of problems around bots and source fragmentation and anonymity online and foreign intervention. And the real challenge here is that these are large, private, global commercial platforms, and we don't have a lot of data about what they're doing. Their incentives are commercial and not democratic, and their policies are really hard to change. And then finally, looking at the call that we'll have in December on more audience-facing interventions focused on information consumption, there are great opportunities in fact-checking and news literacy, and also a lot of skepticism from behavioral scientists about whether or not these things have impact, and questions about how to scale. So I guess in short, I think there are some very interesting opportunities across each of these three areas that we want to explore, and I think none of them are really going to be a silver bullet, is the sense that I think we've all come to, but that together different interventions along this continuum might help to mitigate the problem. And so that is all I wanted to say in terms of context, and then just wanted to turn it over to Josh. But I think we're all very excited to have this conversation. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Really appreciate the work you've done to survey the field and to pull this conversation together with the media impact funders. So I'm Josh Stearns, and I'm the Associate Director of Democracy Fund's Public Square team. And I've actually spent roughly the last 5 years or so working on issues of mis and disinformation. I was one of the founders of First Draft News. Some of you may be familiar with their work on election land and cross-check and other election misinformation efforts. First Draft News is a network of more than 100 newsrooms, tech companies, and universities working to combat misinformation and improve the flow of trustworthy information online. And through that work and a series of related work, I've been really sort of immersed in these issues for a long time. But it hasn't been really until this year that as a funder, I've gotten the chance to support a whole bunch of other people working on this work. And so I'm excited to speak a little bit more about how we came around to that, how we think about that, and really get right into the discussion with this great panelists we have. I'm just going to share 1 or 2 slides as we get started here. And first, I just wanted to tell everybody a bit more about Democracy Fund, because we are a fairly young foundation. We've been around for about 3 years. But Democracy Fund is a bipartisan foundation established by eBay founder and philanthropist Pierre Omidyar to ensure that people come first in the US elections, government, and the public square. So we invest in people and organizations that make democracy work better. Our public square team, where I work, funds projects in a few key areas which really intersect with a lot of the issues that Kelly laid out. So they include press freedom, trust and misinformation, engaged journalism, which for us includes the work of community engagement, but also deep work around diversity, equity, and inclusion in newsrooms and communities, and then strengthening local news. Earlier this year, Democracy Fund partnered with Rita Allen Foundation and the Knight Foundation on a prototype fund to support early stage ideas around trust and misinformation. One of those projects, for example, is the American Library Association, which just announced 5 libraries around the country that are going to be working on new news literacy curriculums rooted in the local communities where they're based. And so really trying to understand how different communities come to these issues in different ways. We also announced $12 million in funding for investigative journalism, press freedom, and local reporting groups earlier this year. And then just last week, we announced a $3 million national matching campaign for nonprofit newsrooms in partnership with Knight and MacArthur Foundations. And you can find out more about that at newsmatch.org. So Democracy Fund is a systems change organization. So our strategies are rooted in understanding the economic, political, cultural, technological, and other systems that shape the issues we care about. Through extensive research and interviews, we map these systems and look for leverage points. So this is one of our systems maps that you should be able to see on your screen. I know that you won't be able to read all of it, but I wanted to give you a sense for how we try to map these different systems. Almost a year ago, our board asked us to begin mapping the systems around trust and press freedom. As part of that work, I began pulling together examples of how foundations were funding in these areas, and we did a literature review of trust across all democratic institutions. Kelly's own research, which she mentioned, was hugely helpful in that work, as was the feedback from many of you on this call. through that work, we came up with a framework that has helped guide our strategy development. And I've just put that up on the screen here. So to fully understand trust issues and combat misinformation through building trust, we have to look across multiple vectors, not just about building trust, but also ensuring trustworthiness. And those two things aren't a single transactional relationship. They're actually more circular and more of a system. But we also have to be attentive to cognitive forms of trust and trustworthiness, such as getting the facts right and doing fact checking, but also affective forms of trust and trustworthiness, which are really much more about the heart than the head and the relationships we build between newsrooms and communities. So understanding this demands we think in really nuanced ways about how we build and break trust, and calls for a wide array of strategies, from fact checking to community building to many, many others, as Kelly was hinting at too. No silver bullets here. And we acknowledge through this work the deep social and epistemological issues around trust, things like partisanship, injustice, and many more that shape people's interactions with news and information. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists who are here today to talk to us a little bit more about the work that they've been doing. I'm happy to talk much more another time about what we're doing with the framework I just showed you and how we're thinking about it in our grant making. But really, they are a great example of hitting different elements on those different vectors. So the work of combating misinformation, building trust, is not just about stopping bad actors or tweaking the platforms, though those things are necessary. They are not sufficient. We also must be creative and thoughtful about the product we produce and the process of that product itself. And that is where these panelists today really shine. They will raise up important questions about how do we make the truth stronger and make it travel further? How do we tell a more complete story that really engages people? How can we be more transparent about our work in ways that add accountability and build trust? And how do we authentically serve communities that have so often been ill-served by reporting historically? So these projects represent new ways of designing journalism for trust and combating misinformation through better news. And with that, I want to say hello and thank you for joining us to Joy Mayer from the Trusting News Project, Sarah Alvarez from Outlier Media, David Bornstein from the Solutions Journalism Network, and Emily Gogotsky from the Membership Puzzle Project. Joy is going to start us off, and so I will kick it to her.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you everyone for being here today and giving us a little bit of your time to talk about this issue that is happily consuming so many of us as we look for creative ways to address it. I am here to talk about the Trusting News Project, which is based at the Reynolds Journalism Institute and is also funded by the Knight Foundation. The goal of this project for the last almost 2 years has been to study how news consumers decide what to trust and really try to bridge the gap in understanding between newsrooms and the communities they aim to serve. There is a perception among journalists that if they do really good work, that's enough, that the key to earning trust is to do good journalism and that people will notice that. And sadly, that's less and less true as people's information diets are more fractured and brand loyalty with news organization changes. And so what I'm here to talk about are some strategies that I am working with newsrooms to test to better tell the story of journalism and what we're trying to do here. So we are studying the cycle of trust at the Trusting News Project, doing research into how people decide what to trust, listening as news consumers describe credible news and trustworthy news, paying attention to which types of news consumers, which demographics and psychographics require which trust indicators, and helping train journalists to directly address those concerns, to talk about journalism in a way that resonates with their communities. Too many journalists feel like there's nothing they can do about this, and that's just not true. So from user interviews and surveying work that we've done recently, the key problem that arises, which will likely not surprise you, is that people have gross misconceptions and assumptions about how journalists do what they do and about the motivations and attitudes they bring with it. Here are a couple of quotes from our user interviews. People think that we're trained to slant the news. They think that they're recognizing when there's balance in the news, but they don't recognize it. Here's a man who points out that Fox includes multiple sides of an issue really well, but that none of these other mainstream organizations do that. Likely it's because Fox does a really fantastic news presenting itself as an institution that believes in fairness and presents multiple sides. CNN, MSNBC, Time, the New York Times are not perceived by this gentleman as doing that as effectively. People tell us that they want to better understand journalism. Here's someone who says she would watch a documentary about what goes on in a newsroom. Sounds riveting to me. I don't know how much of the world would agree, but I love this idea that there are people out there who are hungry for the opportunity to observe journalists' work. Another comment here says that quality journalism includes multiple sources and opposing viewpoints. I think that it's clear that if you say that to journalists, they would say, well, of course we include multiple sources and opposing viewpoints, but it's not always easy for people to recognize. So journalists clearly have a problem telling their own story. They forget sometimes that a lot of journalism is really bad. There's a lot of really bad information and misinformation circulating, and even people who call themselves journalists don't always behave in a way that those of us who are very mission-driven and hold ourselves to high standards would respect. There are people who've been burned by journalism. So we need to do a better job of explaining to people what our standards and ethics are. We need to take ownership over this problem of mistrust and not assume that it's a problem of the public not being educated enough. We need to explain why we're worth people's trust, time, and support, and we need to do that over and over and over. Trust is a long game, and we need to really invest in getting this message across. So I ask newsrooms that I work with on the Trusting News Project, why should your community trust you? Seems like a simple question, but it's not something that a lot of journalists have top of mind as they go about their daily business. What about this information is credible? What about this process might help people understand how I went about collecting information, deciding what to cover, selecting sources, framing it? What about that process might enhance credibility? And then how often and how persuasively are we collecting that information? My goal is to get those messages injected alongside the journalism. Everywhere that we already communicate with our audience, I would like us to inject messages of trust building. I want to communicate what we as journalists value. This is important to us because we know that this is important to our community because I would like to explain our motivation. Our only agenda is to make this community smarter and more engaged. I would like to describe ethics and funding. Man, our news consumers are so hungry to understand the relationship between money and the decisions we make in a newsroom. And they are have a lot of misassumptions, wrong assumptions about how money affects what we do. It's important for us to explain our process, to demonstrate balance, and also to be accessible and responsive and take responsibility for conversations. The other thing we've definitely found is that just the idea that we as journalists value and care about trust increases trust. Our user interviews surfaced many quotes like this one. His opinion of our organization went up somewhat by seeing the survey and by our offer to interview him. Participating in something like the Trusting News Project enhances people's trust in us. And so we need to do a better job as journalists discussing trust and letting our communities know that that is an important part of what we do. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Joy. We're going to move right on, and we're going to have a time for Q&A for everybody afterwards, and we'll give you some instructions about how to get your questions into the mix after the panel. We're going to move on to Sarah Alvarez now, and Sarah's work at Outlier Media in Detroit is really exciting, and I'm so glad she's here to share it with us. Sarah, on to you.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'm Sarah, and I run Outlier Media in Detroit. It's a news and information service for low-income news consumers. It's high-value data journalism. It's personalized and then delivered over text message. I'm going to share my screen just so that you guys can see what it is that we do. All right, so this is how it works. People text in Detroit to this number, and they're going to get back a piece of journalism. I came out of public radio, so I was looking for a way to serve the audience that I'm loyal to and that I most want to serve, which is low-income news consumers, and I didn't really have a way to do that. So I built this approach, and I commissioned some customized tech from Andrew Haig and Ground Source. So that's our platform. The goal is very back to basics journalism. It's to use journalism to fill information gaps and to create accountability. So information gaps are really, that's where accountability goes to die. Low-income news consumers have been seen as not really worth it for a lot of news organizations, and that has really caused information gaps to proliferate. And I really think that that is very short-sighted for our industry and also, of course, for our society. And again, like Joy said, it's, you know, we can't blame news consumers for not liking what we have on offer. We need to create a product that is of real value to them. So I'm just going to go through kind of how this works. I buy cell phone numbers legally, of course, for zip codes in Detroit. More than 80% of folks in Detroit are low income, so I don't really have to work too much at targeting beyond just buying numbers for Detroit. I send batches. I usually use like 5,000 at a time. My bounce rate is super high, but the numbers are pretty cheap. And people get this message, and they can enter in an address. And this happened, yesterday. So then they enter in an address, they get back this report. Right now in Detroit, we're in the middle of the tax auction, so that's really top of mind for people. They need to know if their place that they are living in is getting auctioned out from under them. So that's why it's very short right now. And then after the auction is over in next week, we'll add back in stuff about rental inspections. Okay, so then right now, up to this point, this is an automated bot. But you see that people are asked if they would like a follow-up. So if they do want a follow-up, that's when it becomes personalized. There we go. Oops, I'm sorry. There we go. So when I get a follow-up, it can be all number of things. Most people are just actually asking for a follow-up to see if it's a real thing, like to verify that this is a real service. But I get lots of other questions too. And, you know, my primary goal is to meet the information needs of my news consumers, but I also can use this as an engine to fuel beat reporting and enterprise reporting. And so this is one of the interactions that came to me that fueled an investigative piece that is out today in Bridge Magazine, which is kind of like a statewide ProPublica in Michigan. And I have so many interactions like this, which are about who's the real owner. And I wanted to look into property transfers among speculators. And what I ended up finding was a ton of back tax debt between all these big buyers in the tax auction. So that's a real, this is a great way to fuel enterprise reporting too. Okay, so now I'm going to try to unshare my screen. Let me try. Sorry, guys. And so that I will just stay on that. So I've been working on this since about 2014, refining the model, and now it's been running on all cylinders for about 9 months. It's a very small project. We have a very small budget. But this is the method for our reporting is like a series of steps, and some of these steps can be broken out, and I think they could better serve any audience. We use data to identify the biggest information gaps. Detroit has a lot of data, so I use 211 data from the United Way, federal complaint data, city level complaint data, and that's where we decide, that's how I know where the biggest information gaps are. So that was housing, and that's why the first Outlier project was around housing. I'm starting to move on to the number 2 issue for Detroiters, which is utilities. I'm also looking to use traditional reporting to figure out where information makes the difference. Not resources, not anything else, but information. And that is why I chose information here, where it allows the renter to do something on their own, hold their landlord, hold the city accountable, and then I can focus my resources on bigger, more complex issues like this back tax stuff. I use basic data journalism methods to build these databases, FOIAing, scraping, buying stuff. And I use SMS because I want to serve the broadest range of news consumers possible. I also think there is a lot of potential here for a good business model once people can pay over text. But that's not something that's easy right now. It links to credit cards, and that's not going to work for a lot of my news consumers. So you guys saw how follow-up works. We don't rely on brand loyalty. I think that high-value information can speak for itself, and that personalized touch, engaging directly through information. People ask me a lot, I'll just this is how, I want to close. People ask me a lot if I get really off-the-wall questions from folks, and I do not. It's very rare. And I've been very gratified and to find that what people want is accountability. And that is the same thing that I want. People use that word again and again. And I think that that is really hopeful, because that means that people still believe in institutions, even in a place like Detroit where institutions have let people down for a long time. And people still believe in the power of journalists to increase accountability. So I just want to end on that note, because I think it's very hopeful, and it's something that has been surfacing in my work again and again and again.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I really appreciate that. We're going to go to David Bornstein next of the Solutions Journalism Network and try to understand a little bit more about how telling a more full story of not just problems, but also solutions might help us understand, building trust and combating misinformation. David, it looks like you're still muted. Let's try again.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, great, thanks.
Okay. So can you see the screen? I just shared you should see a map.
Yep.
Okay, great. So basically, first of all, I just want to echo everything that everyone said. I think that from our experience, we're a network called the Solutions Journalism Network, and we basically do trainings and workshops with news organizations around the United States to really do a kind of mindset shift around the idea that the news product should not only point out and hold people accountable for problems, but is actually does a better job holding people accountable if it also shows how people are trying to respond to these problems in good faith with the same level of sort of rigor and independence that you do in investigative journalism. And so if you cover the emerging responses, the public has a sense that these problems exist, but there's also a lot of forces in society of efforts to repair those problems. And you get more of a balanced, and we would argue a more faithful view of the world. And this is a piece of journalism that almost every journalist will say we don't do enough of. And the reason why this is so related to the issue of trust is because in our experiences working with really thousands of journalists now, there's this constant through line that we hear, which is that trust is not merely a function of being accurate. That's a very key piece. It's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. It's really a function of relationships. You earn trust by showing people that in fact you have their backs, that you care about them. And then they, and you show people that you care about them by listening to them, by holding people accountable for the problems that they care about, and by also showing them that you're really trying to be helpful in providing information that could allow the community to improve. And it sort of can be summed up in the statement, I don't care what you know until I know that you care. And so how do we sort of telegraph as journalists our caring for the communities? And I think one of the key ways we do it is in the product itself, the actual kinds of stories that we tell and how they can, in some cases, reinforce very, very damaging narratives, particularly in marginalized communities that are a mainstay of news. So I just want to give a few examples of some of the projects we've worked on, and then maybe sort of tie it together with a few studies that have been done by the Tao Center where they found some interesting things. So one series that we worked on is something called the Education Lab in Seattle. This is the current story about that. I've used up my free Seattle Times stories, unfortunately, so I have to show this one. But what they've been doing for 4 years is essentially covering education through the lens of what can we learn from what's working, and how can we hold people more accountable to poor performance by showing that better performance is sometimes possible, even if it's not happening in Seattle. So they'll often cover programs in Seattle or policies inside or outside the city, and then bring back those ideas to show that there are better ways to handle student misbehavior other than sort of suspending them in a very racialized way, which is a watchdog series that they did that showed that suspensions were highly racialized, and also showing that there were alternative approaches to discipline that were being used around the country that in some cases were highly effective. So this really held people accountable, but it also showed people that there were interesting models happening. And what the Seattle Times has found doing this for 4 years is that trust really improved. There's a high level of trust for Education Lab, the series itself. When the reporters themselves go into communities to interview students or to interview educators, the sources actually feel that they're more likely to be characterized faithfully and fairly, even if their efforts to improve reading scores or something didn't work. It's not just a gotcha story. It's a story that looks at the process of how people are trying to fix things, and that this is really built up over time. And now they've created new versions of this approach that they're applying to transportation problems and now homelessness as well. The sort of spread throughout the newsroom. In Minneapolis, oh no, I'm using up my free subscriptions. Shoot. Okay, I'm going to tell you about that. In Minneapolis, what happened in the Star Tribune is they got the Somali community there got a lot of very negative coverage because of some radicalization of youth who were being recruited by ISIS. And there were a few incidents of violence, and this became the whole narrative about the Somali community. So we were working with editors at the Star Tribune, and they decided to do something different. And what they started doing was, in addition to hiring a Somali reporter and translating a series of articles in their series into Somali, they started looking at what really works to reduce youth radicalization and what is actually happening already in the community by leaders in the community that hasn't been covered, and what are happening in places around the world, including sending a reporter to Denmark to see how they were handling the approach better, perhaps, than other cities were doing, and how they were really mucking it up in London, and bringing those stories back to Minneapolis and then sharing them with the community through focus groups. They organized a listening post where they were really pulling in comments from the community, not just comments, but essentially generating the insights for the reporting from the community. And this had an enormous impact. The editor, Suki Dardarian, said that the community not only didn't trust the paper, but they thought the paper was in cahoots with the authorities in trying to catch people in the community. And so this had a transformational effect because the product itself was really all about how can we help young people in this community? What do we need to learn? And it led to $2 million in funding for a youth center in an area of Minneapolis where the youth really needed that. And then one other example is this one that I'm showing now, is the poverty puzzle that was done in Chattanooga. This was actually a finalist for the Pulitzer, and they spent an enormous amount of time looking at what is the nature of poverty in Chattanooga. It's very, very deep pockets of poverty in the city, and what are essentially all of the efforts that we know of that are happening in Chattanooga to try to reduce poverty. And what's interesting about this series is that not many of these efforts were that successful. Some of them showed they were moving the needle a little bit. Some of them were very promising or marginally promising, but the verdict is still out. But the effect of really exploring this question of how are we as a community trying to respond to our poverty, rather than sort of just kind of slamming it, it had a very powerful effect on the community. And we've gotten just emails and emails from the reporters and from the publishers that have been shared by the audience saying, one of them came from Joan McLean, who was the author of this series, who said that no one in the newsroom can believe the civility of the Facebook comments. It is miraculous. Something kind of exciting is happening. The trust between papers and readers can be rebuilt. Interestingly, when the Tao Center at Columbia was looking at some of the effects of solutions journalism, they did an interesting study in an area that used to be called South Central Los Angeles, where they did a focus group. So they did 6 focus groups with 48 African American and Latino residents of that community. And they had many of the same comments that people sort of in the flyover zones of the United States have had about journalists. Nobody really pays attention to what we care about, and they are constantly sort of maligning our communities. And what they said was that, what the researchers said is that in underrepresented communities of color where audiences feel neglected and harmed by traditional media, through these narratives that are very focused on pathologies, that the ability to sort of look at their communities through what are the emerging responses, the solutions journalism lens, they said it offers a pathway to rebuild constructive and mutually beneficial relationships of trust, essentially by showing communities that there is agency and essentially reflecting them back to themselves in what they feel of is a fair light and surfacing knowledge that is resident in the community that the community wants, that could help the community in a sense through a repair process. They also went to Ohio and Kentucky and looked at the question of polarization. And what was interesting there was they also found that polarization, you'll see in the recommendations based on our conversations, we think you should explore local issues and local angles on national issues with a solutions journalism approach, collaborate with outlets that residents are already reading, watching, and listening to, and provide opportunities for community engagement and participatory journalism. But particularly the issue of polarization has not been covered as a deficit issue. And in fact, there seems to be some emerging, I wouldn't say good research, but there's an emerging sense among some researchers that polarization is often a function of powerlessness, a really deep sense of a lack of efficacy and agency, a sense that you feel helpless. And so if the news is feeding into a sense of sort of a narrative of brokenness that makes people feel helpless, that also can contribute to extreme polarization and create very rich fodder for people to essentially be vulnerable to misinformation because of the priming that the news has led them to.
Hey, David,
so,
that's actually that's a great point. And I'm noticing that in the participant list, we have a number of people who I think could also bring some expertise to this. I want to make sure that we have time for a broader conversation as well. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to move on to Emily to make sure that we have some time for Emily and for the broader conversation. I really appreciate that. We'll share those links in the chat as well.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Emily Goliski is the Membership Puzzle Project Research Director and has really been on the forefront of looking at how not only do we need to adapt the business model, but also the product and process of journalism so that the entirety of what we do is built around a trusting social contract. So with that, Emily, why don't you take it from here?
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. Let me go ahead and just pull this up quickly. Together with Jay Rosen, I represent the Membership Puzzle Project, which is a collaboration between NYU Journalism School and Day Correspondent, which is a member-funded newsroom based in Amsterdam, from whom we have learned an amazing amount about how to work with members, not just to benefit the journalism, but also to aid the operational bottom line. And what we have seen in our work throughout this year is all of the ways in which optimizing for trust really goes beyond fact-checking, that it's looking at the design of the entire news organization, at its journalistic practices, its data privacy policies, its policies around advertising, and in general, really fostering a culture of curiosity throughout both business side and newsroom concerns. And one of our core research questions in this work has really been, how might we better align incentives across what it is that news consumers need and how they can feel a sense of belonging, and also how it is that our organizations can be more sustainable and how we can really foster a free and open press. So I wanted to just quickly share with you some of the things that we have consistently heard as we've undertaken research work qualitatively around the world. First, some of the things that we are hearing from news organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit, is that their membership really is no longer a nice to have. We're seeing a lot of interest in this work because it represents a potential way to deliver for news consumers and to be there for them in the years to come. And so we see a high evolution in regards to these programs, some of which are really meaningful and muscular in the way that they represent two-way knowledge exchange, not just I'm a legacy news outlet and I'm going to give you all the news you need to know, but let me hear from you the things that really matter to you so that you can actually aid me in this storytelling. And we think that that is just fantastically exciting. And we think that, some of the strongest sites really have figured out how to benefit from audience knowledge and expertise in ways that are highly creative. I'll share a couple of examples with you. So Inside Story in Greece had members present to them numerous story investigations or numerous ideas for potential investigations after the Greek debt crisis. And they said, we simply don't have the reporting bandwidth to be able to deliver on this, but why don't you come up with your best story pitch, present those ideas to each other. Together with your fellow members, you'll vote on the stories that you most want to see investigated, and we will assign reporters from our staff to co-report those stories with you. And so it ends up being sort of this win-win for everyone, where the news outlet now gets access to stories they didn't have the bandwidth to tell earlier. Other readers are able to learn from those stories, and the members who pitched the stories got almost a deep dive into investigative journalism. Another example that we're excited about is the Ferret in Scotland, which hosts Sunday fact-checking events, a lot of skills workshops for their members. Really, they keyed into something important, which was that their members didn't just want to come to sort of meet and greet events with reporters. They really wanted more take-home value. And this is really exciting when we think about how do you go from brand ambassadors to really educating your subscribers and your members. Again, this idea of two-way knowledge exchange that's mutually beneficial and in which both parties feel like they're getting the better end of the deal. I think it really starts with rigorously designing the social contract. So not just taking it for granted that people are going to want to keep supporting you year after year, but that there really is sort of that exchange that's fantastically valuable. My last example for you is from Day Correspondent, our partner in the Netherlands, which has created a real reporter culture around asking for expertise. So here you can see Tamar, one of their correspondents, who spends anywhere from 30 to 50% of her time in direct contact with her community members. And she has the opportunity for people to follow her work directly, really to follow her beat, which is the non-human beat. She sort of recognized that 99% of news was about human beings, and she really wanted to cover the 1% that wasn't. And she's generated this really fantastic community of people who would have been readers in the past, but now tip her off to story ideas, serve as technical proofreaders, and beyond. So I want to quickly shift to tell you some of the things we've learned from members themselves. So it's important to us that we not just understand that contract in regards to the organizations themselves, but that we also understand what members tell us they really care about. And over again, in the members we've interviewed around the world, we hear that unique value and really offering the world something that should exist is much more important than utility. And we think of utility as, in the example of a paywall, being able to work around a paywall and subscribing simply so that you save yourself the effort. We really hear that, yes, members care about that, but they want to go much deeper, that they want to support something that they can't get anywhere else. And something that has similarly been surprising and very hope-inducing for me is that exclusivity and insider access are not what members tell us they really care about. The idea of being sort of on the inside enjoying a limited good is not why they care. They really want to see that work be open to more people so that they can share stories and that other people who aren't members or aren't subscribers can also benefit from that information. And so we take that as a real call that they're seeking quality that distinguishes this work from unreliable media, sort of getting back to what Joy shared at the beginning of the call. Similarly, they're telling us that merchandise and sort of branded goods are less important. They would rather see reporting and operational staff really focus on the work to be done and telling the world those stories. The last little bit that I want to share with you is some of the work that we have learned from analogous or non-news organizations. So this includes faith-based organizations, unions, co-working spaces, co-living spaces, is the idea of team tryouts. So sometimes you can think about this in terms of both parties coming back together at the end of an agreed upon amount of time to say, did this work? Are we interested in furthering this contract and in moving forward? And I think that that's really exciting when we think about, going well beyond transaction to foster a sense of belonging. The idea that after an agreed upon amount of time, you're going to be able to come back to the table and say, are we meeting each other's needs? And are we able to create something bigger by being in collaboration? And we also heard quite a bit about the idea of flexible, personalized arrangements. And this is something that we are really excited as we begin working with a set of research affiliates around the world to really try on, okay, well, what might this look like? How can we prototype some solutions around these ideas? We are developing a number of different tools, including an open database that lists organizations that are trying new innovations in this space. You can find it at membershippuzzle.org. And if you have ideas for other organizations that are not represented there, please, we want to be able to share exemplars with the rest of the world. So do share your work and please reach out with any questions.
Thanks so much, Emily. And I just want to put in another endorsement for that database that Emily was just showing on the screen. It is an immense amount of work that's gone into that, and it is an incredible resource. The amount of details they have about how organizations structure their membership programs is going to be of use, I think, to news organizations for years to come. So do go check that out. And thank you again, Emily. We're going to move into the Q&A section, and you all who are participating in the audience have a sort of Q&A button on the left. It should be up on the left side of your screen that should allow you to ask questions in the chat function. And we'll be monitoring that and pulling questions into the discussion. But I'm going to just start out as people are thinking over what they want to ask with a question that thinks about the shift in how journalists think about their role in this new information age, which is, for a long time, people have thought of journalism as get the facts and share them. But now we're in a situation where the ecosystem is flooded with non-facts, with misinformation, with a whole set of other data that is interfering with getting the facts and sharing it. So what is the role of newsrooms, and how do you all think in your work about going beyond getting the facts and sharing it to possibly debunking bad facts, or stopping rumors from spreading, or confronting misinformation and in your communities? One example of this that we saw most recently was rumors and misinformation about ICE raids that were circulating across Brooklyn and on the West Coast as well, that were total hype and terrifying communities. And what is our role as information providers to both get the good information out and stop the bad information? I'd love for Sarah, maybe if you or Joy, you want to think about that, given the work that you all have been doing as a starting place.
Sure, I can start. I mean, I think it is to get the facts. I think it's to show our audience that they really are facts. And I think it's to follow up with our audience when they have questions about those facts, because facts don't meet, facts are facts, but it's not going to answer everybody's questions. And I think people do have some questions about things like ICE raids, about things like whether or not their home is stable, about, why their utilities are off, that are so fundamental to them. And we really, I think, can step in as journalists and provide this service that is to say, we know how to get answers quickly and we know how to make people responsive. We're going to step in here.
I definitely agree. And I think it goes back to this idea that it's our problem as journalists. It's not just a community-wide problem. It's this idea that we can call out bad information, that we can fact check comments and reply to people who have something wrong and call each other out. And, every time I see a journalist share something that's not right or not true, I'm reminded of how easy it is to do that, to get misled by something or to get swept up in the emotion of something. And if it's not our problem, whose problem is it? We've just got to be vigilant about explaining why our information is credible and explaining why other information isn't, and teach people to be smarter about their information diet.
I think that education piece is something that we have just heard time and time again, even amongst the savviest news consumers, and the importance of explaining and re-explaining how the business of media works and the ways in which it's subsidized, I think is really important, and a real call for that education and those reminders, because we can't take it as a given that everyone understands the differences in the ways the storytelling is taking place. And I would say I am really encouraged by the multiple means of participation and the invitations that we're seeing some journalists engage in. I mean, at a really high level, I think of David Fahrentholtz's work, Pulitzer Prize winning work, and the idea of really crowdsourcing details. And I think that takes some vulnerability and humility to say, I don't have all the answers. Can you please help me find them? And I'm very eager to see more work sort of in that spirit.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I mean, one of the first things when I learned about Sarah's project at Outlier Media, I thought about folks I knew who worked in tenants' rights and how many questions there are about what rights tenants do and don't have in renting situations and that sort of thing. And I think that things we think about Maslow's, layers of needs here, and shelter is right up there. And so being able to both provide good information about it, but also combat the bad stuff and rumors that rise up, that's a daily life sort of thing. We don't need to talk about Russia and bots to talk about that. So I think reminding ourselves that not just that this misinformation stuff isn't new, that it's been around for a long time, and it's actually affected different communities very differently. And for some communities, this has been a life or death situation for a long time, that misinformation about them and their communities has led to characterizations in the media that shape our perceptions, shape laws, shape behaviors. So I think that that's important. The other thing that I heard when you mentioned David Fahrenthold was that was a great example of a new model of accountability reporting. But it wasn't just that David Fahrenthold was holding somebody accountable. He was also accountable to the people on Twitter. So I'd love for you all to talk a little bit about how, because accountability came up in almost every single one of your talks. So I would love to hear a little bit more about how you think about how accountability plays into, trust and stopping misinformation. Emily, I saw you nodding. Do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yep, absolutely. And I think that idea of reporters also being accountable is something that we would be remiss not to talk about. I am really excited by the way that Day Correspondent and now a couple of other outlets stateside are encouraging their reporters to share work in progress. And that to me was this idea, I had never heard of that. It felt so counterintuitive, the idea that you would tell people what you were working on. What if you got scooped? And now I've sort of come around to the mindset that if you tip people off to your work and they're eager to follow on, it really means you're on to something. I think that by opening up the stories and saying, look, there are gaps in my knowledge, help me fill this in, help me identify sources that might be of interest, or being very forthright and saying, there are places I'm actually a little unsure and I feel a little uncomfortable publishing until we absolutely confirm this. Can you help us do that? And I would love if others on the call have examples of places they've seen that play out. I think it's highly promising, and it's a real paradigm shift and requires editors who back those reporters and say, being forthright in those ways doesn't weaken you, it actually strengthens you. It has the opposite effect that you might intend.
Thanks, Emily. And I know Vince wants to jump in, I think, with a comment or question as well. Vince, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, just unmuted. So I just wanted to make a connection. Listening to Emily, I'm reminded that the first time we tried to learn how to pronounce Goligoski was a few years back when she was presenting around her work with badges for Mozilla. And I think this is like an idea that's welling up underneath our discussion here, and that is by opening up our work to the consumer, that helps to build trust. But by recognizing expertise among the consumers and giving them specific acknowledgement of that expertise through the badges concept, through the public insight network that NPR initiated, through Harkin and other forms, you know, there's a lot of work that probably could be connected to the trust conversation about recognizing expertise and elevating those voices to make it a shared product and not just a trust us over here, the experts.
Yeah, I want to.
Can I? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to share a quick comment. I was hanging out at one of the few legal offices that does a lot of housing work. And I was talking to a gentleman who's had a lot of trouble having his place auctioned out from under him a couple of times. And I was asking him, who do you think needs to step up? Do you think the city needs to step up or the county needs to step up? And he looked right at me and he said, the media. And I was like, point taken. You're right. And so I feel like, you know, by being transparent, by giving out your phone number, by having people always be able to contact you. And again, I do not get crazy requests. People contact me when, you know, they go to a legal office and they're not getting any help. It's, you know, by being very accountable and being very available, it also allows me to be very impartial because I really am hearing about all the places that the system's breaking down. And that's what people want us to do. And so I feel like that's what we have to do.
David, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add, maybe just add a layer of questioning to this conversation. So, you know, one of the things that is extremely frustrating to, as we work with a lot of partners around the country, is almost like the limitations of facts. and you know, the deeply entrenched cognitive biases that people have, the motivated denial that's behind the resistance to a lot of facts. And I do think that building these relationships and these transparent and what's behind the curtain kind of stuff in journalism is absolutely essential. I'm also sort of a little concerned about, you know, some of the research about global warming that says that the consistent dire warnings about global warming push more people into a motivated denial of global warming, where their cognitive biases lead them to minimize the messages, to deny the messages, to disbelieve the messenger, and so forth, for very well-known, you know, sort of emotional or cognitive tendencies that we all have. And so I'm really grappling with what is the stance that journalism should have when we know that one of the big problems is the next really serious report on global warming, which says it's even worse than we thought, is likely to meet with equally strong resistance because it's true. And we still have to deal with these things called human beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, David, I think that's a really important point, critical really. And I think that, you know, in the work that I've done and Kelly has done with some of the research, which we referred to at the top, reaching out to cognitive psychologists and behavioral psychologists has been a key part of that. And I think we need to connect the dots between practitioners and academics in new ways. I know that there's some events coming up this fall, including one at University of Pennsylvania Annenberg School around trying to connect some of those dots. And so hopefully we'll begin to get in places where the academic research that tells us so much about how we might shape our practice can get more a foothold with the practitioners too, and have a fruitful conversation back and forth. I wanted to just recognize that we are at time. I think that we may have had some problems with the Q&A functionality, and so I apologize that we couldn't bring in more questions from the audience. I have found this to be a super rich conversation, and I'm so thankful for the panelists who took their time to be here and for everyone who organized this. We're going to capture all of the links and references that people mentioned during their presentations and collect that in one place. So we will have that available either on the Media Impact Funders site or in a follow-up email, but we'll make sure that you can have access to follow on this conversation. And I'm sure that all the panelists will be excited to continue the conversation with you via email or Twitter or other forums. So I'm going to wrap that up here and say thank you all so much for being here. Kelly, is there anything else that you'd like to say to close us out?
No, just that we're really looking forward to the next call on distribution channels and the role of social media platforms in November. And thank you all so much.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.